Welcome back, folks, to the Modern State. I am Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Today, we are going to look at how the United States is coming into its own. It's becoming a world power. We're looking at post World War I at this point. So, some things to note. I think a lot of us sort of take for granted the fact that the United States is like the world power, right? Well, it wasn't always the case. World War I made us a world power, and World War II is going to make us the world power. And at the end of the Cold War, we are going to be the last superpower left. And of course, so that's important to make a note of that. But at any rate, let's talk about some historical context before we get into the nitty gritty of this. So some of this is going to be a little bit of review before we really get moving into the new content. So, all right, this is a timeline. Obviously, you don't have to memorize every single thing that's in here, but for this particular video lesson, what I want you to pay attention to are some particular things. So in 1920 to 21, we did have an economic recession, and then we went into record economic growth. That record economic growth is going to be really, really important because we're going to grow too fast, too much, too fast, and that's going to get us to the 1930s and the late 1920s where the economy starts to take a dive. So actually, right before our economy went right into the toilet, we had record economic growth. Okay, in 1923, we have some instability there. President Harding dies. Calvin Coolidge becomes president. 1924, where we're trying to lock down the United States. There's a lot of people that are going back to being isolationist. We're not a fan of immigrants. National Origins Act comes into play, and we start seeing other laws that are put into play to limit immigration. 1925, you got the Scopes trial, sometimes called the Scopes monkey trial. That is in that year is also, or the 1920s generally, is when the KKK peaks in power. A lot of people mistakenly think that the height of the power of the KKK was immediately after the Civil War, but that's not the case. At this point in history, in the 1920s, the KKK is effectively the Democratic Party. So this is really, really bad for race relations, really, really bad for our march towards equality. And you're not going to see that really get much better until we move into the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. And then as we move through the 20s, we have the start of the Great Depression in 1929. And in 1932, it's going to come to a head. There are going to be all these problems. I'm going to talk about these items once we get there. But that's the big picture from the timeline. Okay, so some backstory to the 1920s. The big thing I want you to remember about the 1920s is that it's like a story of opposites. Okay, of like the coexistence of seemingly opposite things, right? You've got laws banning alcohol and a constitutional amendment banning it, yet you have nightclubs where alcohol proliferates. You've got this battle between science versus religion. They're at odds with each other. Nobody's looking to figure out how to meld these two or make them work together. They are at odds. You have these larger than life heroes, but you also have these really super villainous people like Sacco and Vanzetti were considered super villains. Then you've got Charles Lindbergh as this larger than life celebrity hero. And speaking of Lindbergh, he completes the first successful transatlantic flight. Henry Ford also maximized the use of the assembly line, which makes goods cheaper, but still the culture of work and how much the industrial workers are getting taken advantage of was massive. So you've got the epitome of optimism and the abyss of depression on each end of the 20s. So it's a decade of extremes. It's a decade of opposites. So I want you to keep that in mind when you're learning about the 1920s. So some politics. The Republicans came in and started doing some new stuff. Now at this point, corporations are still largely controlling the economy and economic policy. Okay. And this is going to be a problem, as we'll see once the Great Depression hits. This is going to be a major, major problem. So the Democrats were Cox and Roosevelt. They wanted participation in the League of Nations. It was Wilson-driven progressivism, a very particular brand of progressivism. Then you have the Republicans on the other end, Harding and Coolidge, very pro-business, very conservative, and they repealed all the wartime corporate tax rates. So this allowed this gigantic boom, but it was an artificial boom. Okay, this was made possible largely because government let the companies do whatever they wanted, and they did. And things they were engaging in were going to spell disaster for the national economy once we get to the Great Depression. There's this thing called corporate capitalism. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. You have economic expansion abroad, but isolationism at home. All right, so politically we were very isolationist, but economically we were very internationalist. And this is in keeping with the extremes, this idea of extremes during the 1920s. Isolationist politically, but internationalist and expansionist economically. That's important. Okay, so Harding administration. Harding had some problems. There were massive, massive scandals during the Harding administration. I'm just going to talk about a few of them. But he did have a strong cabinet that was composed of both conservatives and progressives. So Herbert Hoover, who's going to be president during the Great Depression, he was Secretary of Commerce. And actually, he did a pretty good job as Secretary of Commerce. As president, that's going to be another issue entirely, but we'll get to that. They did repeal, as I said before, the wartime corporate tax rates. So this freed up investment, right? Freed up money for investment, and man, did they invest. More than investing, they speculated. They played games with other people's money, and this would be a major, major cause of the Great Depression, but we'll get to that. So the Federal Trade Commission largely did not do its job. It ignored antitrust laws. It did not engage in any kind of price controls. Business could do whatever they wanted. So if they wanted to gouge you with with massive increases in prices, they could totally do that, and there was no stopping the business from doing that. So we have some scandals, as I said. The Secretary of Interior was actually sent to prison. He's like the only cabinet secretary to have this happen to him. He took over $300,000 in bribes, which is ridiculous. And then after the death of Harding, Coolidge takes over. He had a different governing style than Harding, and we're going to see some changes there. So Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, this guy was famous for being a really, really quiet, mild-mannered guy. He finished out Harding's term and then was elected to his own in 1924. There's a famous story of a woman walking up to Coolidge, and she says, "Mr. President, I bet a friend of mine that I can get you to say more than 2 words in a conversation." He looks at her and says, "You lose," and walks away. So she lost the bet, poor thing. But so he was very, very reserved, very quiet. He would never get elected in the modern election environment that we have now. He did get a third-party challenge from progressive candidates who advocated for the nationalization of railroads, public ownership of utilities, and a constitutional amendment for Congress to be able to overrule the Supreme Court, which would have really caused a problem for separation of powers, but that's a different story. The Democrats were very sharply divided. They disagreed on all these things: prohibition, immigration, and race relations. And like I said, at this point, the Democratic Party is the KKK. And the KKK is the Democratic Party, so it was a major problem. So campaigns for that election centered on isolationism and foreign policy, tax cuts to business, and some aid to farmers, which farmers were getting desperate. That's the first cog in the Great Depression wheel, is when the farmers start to get squeezed. And that's going to spell disaster for the country, but we'll get to that. So we have this thing called corporate capitalism. Well, what is that exactly? Well, you have family-run, independently owned small business declining because these big corporations are buying them out and basically putting them out of business. There's this new business model of CEOs running companies owned by stockholders, which we largely still have today. There are some differences, but it's largely the same exact model. You have this larger-than-life corporation with almost total control of individual markets. So antitrust law is not being enforced, even though we got, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 and the Clayton Antitrust Act in 1914. Federal regulators are ignoring this. They're letting businesses do what they want. We didn't have monopolies. We had something called oligopolies. What is an oligopoly? It is when a small number of companies dominate an entire industry and they collude together. So it's like you have 5 companies that are dominating one industry, or 3 companies, and they all agree to set prices around the same so that you don't really have a choice in the matter. And the fact is they're colluding. Okay, and that is now illegal, but it wasn't then. New York at this point becomes the financial center of the country, and that is largely what's kept New York's economic engine booming, with the Federal Reserve Bank located in New York City and also the stock exchange. So in 1929, we reached this problem where 50% of the nation's banking resources was controlled by 1% of the banks. And they were playing games with people's money, playing games. Inflation went through the roof, prices rose dramatically. You have a bad recession that does tame inflation, but unemployment rose. So this was not good times, but at least it wasn't that long. Afterwards, you have some steady economic growth, which leads to huge increases in GDP. New industries are becoming available, and these new products spurred a lot of growth. Remember, well, I'm going to talk about it in a minute, but leisure time changed in the United States, where people, because of these new machines and new inventions, they had more time, leisure time. So new industries started to develop to fill that void. People wanted to spend money and spend their time doing fun things like going to sporting events, for example, going to the theater. So industries started cropping up to address that need, that desire from the American public. Former industries that used to be like going like gangbusters, they struggled. Farming, coal, and textiles. Those companies are struggling. For farmers and miners, this was bad times. This was not good times for them. They were really, really struggling all throughout the 20s. But white collar industrial workers were doing pretty good, at least until the Great Depression hit in 1929. But we'll get to that. So we have this idea of welfare capitalism where management, the companies were responsible for workers' well-being. So they had two primary goals in doing this. One was to cultivate a strong, stable, loyal workforce, and the other was to reduce power of unions and membership in unions. Because when you can collectively bargain, then the companies have to kowtow. So they were trying to keep people happy enough, not necessarily keep them happy, but happy enough that they wouldn't go and try to join or start a labor union. So there's a couple of key court cases. You won't need to memorize these, but just so you're aware that they happened. The Colorado Coal versus United Mine Workers. A striking union could be punished for illegal restraint of trade. So this went against the unions. And Atkins versus Children's Hospital, no minimum wage for workers in D.C. That also hurt workers. So most of these court cases were siding in favor of the capitalists, of the companies, and not in favor of labor or your average person. So that was an issue as well. So we have this massive economic expansion abroad, right? We refused to join the League of Nations because it made us accountable to an international body, and our Senate wasn't here for that. They're like, we should be accountable to no one but the people of the United States. We're not signing on to the League of Nations. And because we didn't, the League of Nations effectively fell apart, and of course we get World War II, but that's later. We had a lot, the United States had our fingers in a lot of pies. We were just putting our fingers and dipping our toe into the water of all these other countries, putting factories, engaging in selling to them and buying from them. That's going to be a problem for the Great Depression because it wasn't just us. Okay, this was a worldwide problem, and part of the reason it spread the way it did was because the United States was economically had its fingers in all these different countries' pies. Okay, Mexico attempted to nationalize the oil industry. Standard Oil, of course, didn't like that because they're not going to make the money they want to make. But hey, Rockefeller always has a problem unless he has complete control. So we had in 1921 this thing called the Washington Naval Arms Conference, and the goal of this was to keep people from militarizing, right? So we're trying to deal with the M in Maine. If you remember the causes of World War I, we have Maine, M for militarism. So this is an attempt to try to deal with that. The Kellogg-Briand Agreement was another one. Frank Kellogg convinced the French to condemn it, but that's great that they condemn it, but that didn't do anything. It lacked mechanisms of enforcement, so both of these things were unsuccessful. The world did continue to militarize, and this is going to be important for World War II. And that is the end of this video lesson. I will see you in part 2.